Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. I'm glad that you could join us this morning. Listen, you can tell I'm wearing a sweater. I'm not just out to torture myself in the heat of summer. Linda and I are actually up in Michigan in a rustic cabin, kind of working at home, away from home during this continued sort of time of social distancing and quarantine. And you can tell automatically, or right off the bat, the sweater gives a giveaway. It's about 55 degrees for a high today, and it's been pretty chilly this morning when we woke up. And then you'll notice this painting. It's a little bit awkward painting on the wall. Well, it's a rustic cabin, and strange things happen in rustic cabins, like why is there a massive plug in the wall, right in the middle of the wall? Anyway, so we covered it up because I know how much you all like to pay attention to details like that. So listen, this morning we're going to cover a couple of things, but first I got to say thank you to Elizabeth and to the band. In the background you may hear some construction, by the way, because they're remodeling a cabin next to us, and hopefully that won't get too disruptive, or too distracting. But Elizabeth, awesome job, amazing job on that song, and the band did such a great job. And I chose that song because I want to think about the ways in which we put up barriers, the way in which we participate in creating dysfunctional systems in spite of what we truly want. You know, one of the things that we long for is this idea of belonging and being connected to life. And the song, of course, is, pave paradise, put up a parking lot. We look for paradise, but then we pave over it. We put up parking lots. We put up structures. DDT, we look to find ways to solve one problem, which is to save the crops by killing off the bugs. And in the process, we discovered we were not only poisoning the earth and those of us who eat from that, but also killing off the bees, which provide 90% of the pollination in the world. And so it was like Rumi said, stop seeking for love, but instead start seeking for the barriers that we put up against it, right? So here's what we're going to cover this morning as I look at this idea of dysfunctional systems and where we find ourselves right now at this time. First, I'm just going to read through this. Make a list of your own there so you can kind of keep up with me if you want, or maybe Hans will put it up on the screen, and that way I can keep myself going here. So I'm just going to read the list of what's going to get covered. 2 questions, class dismissed. I need to be schooled, part 1. Systems, a definition, a working definition. If you don't understand, you might be part of the problem. A 2,300-year-old example. Grapes of Wrath. Getting Schooled, Part 2. How to tell the truth. You can't tell us apart. And then finally, next steps, a path toward healing. So a couple of weeks ago, I was with a friend, a black friend of mine, who just raised a couple of questions. I mean, we're in this time that we're in, not just the pandemic, but the violence and the protests related to George Floyd's death and the death of others in relation to that, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. Just as examples, it's just been an awakening to the violence that seems to be perpetuated against a particular class. But of course, all people of color experience these kinds of things, but in particular, we're aware right now of how much does Black Lives Matter. And so in that sense, he just raised these 2 questions to me. He said, first of all, Tom, he said, have you ever entered into an intersection, a crosswalk, where a car's pulled up, stopped, you look over, you see the white woman in the car, and as you're crossing in front, she turns over and locks the door. Wow. He said, when you approach a police officer, do you find yourself becoming anxious? Your heart rate increases, and you start thinking about you're going to get blamed for something, or you're going to get accused of something. Yeah, I mean, I've studied racism. Linda and I both attended psychology classes. I have a 2nd degree in social work. We studied racial relationships all throughout the late 70s into the 80s. We studied that in seminary. Of course, we studied that. But then for 20 years or so, I toured around the country and performed at festivals and schools and shared platforms and stages and interactions in small groups with a number of Black, Indigenous, people of color and their stories. And it was powerful to experience the connections that we found. There was this vulnerability and honesty that allowed us to find connections, common grounds, common themes in all of our stories. But yet, in spite of all of that, I still don't know what it's like not to see the sign on the door say open all the time. And we talked about this last week. Whereas so many others have always seen the doors closed. Their whole systemic history has been about that door being closed. Everything from incredible violence and oppression to simply biases and negative orientations because of the sound of your voice, the color of your skin, or even perhaps your background. So I don't know what that's really like. I can't understand that. But it's a part of the system we find ourselves in. So I'm going to give a working definition of of how I understand systems. And then we'll talk a little bit about this system that we find ourselves in. A working definition, basically a system is a unit made up of various participants, various individuals, each of whom plays a specific role in the functionality of that unit, of that system, or the dysfunctionality of that unit. Okay, so for example, all of us are parts of systems. Yes, we are, every one of us. Family systems, classroom, school systems, work systems. A work environment is a system. Our cultures can be systems. Our churches can be a system. The tribes that we belong into, the small tribes that we belong to. The ecosystem we just talked about with the bees and DDT. I mean, the globe is a system, as we realize what our effect with the pandemic and our interconnectedness and interdependency with this. So we're all part of systems, but the key about understanding a system is knowing your part in it. And we often don't know the part we play in the system. So in a family system therapy situation, the theory behind it is to get everyone in the system involved to participate, to come together, and to begin to explore not just what the symptoms are, because that's always the problem. That's always what people notice. And they start pointing fingers and blaming and assigning blame to different parts of the system. To get everybody, though, the process is to get everybody together to then talk about what is at the heart of the system, and are we playing into that? What is the goal of the system, and are we participating in that? Or are our stories that we tell ourselves, or what the baggage we bring into the moment, are those things guiding us and creating a dysfunctional pattern, a destructive pattern? It's hard to do that. It's hard to get everybody to come together, but those are first steps in any kind of systemic therapy, and certainly the same is true for us as we are in a systemic reality of kind of racism in our country. The key point here is that if you don't understand what your place is, your role is in the system, then you are part of the problem. And secondly, if you find yourself being defensive about that role or blaming others, you're still part of the problem, because the system's functionality depends on everyone being focused on its purpose. All right, and we talked about Jesus and how he advocated for the kingdom of God, but what he advocated was for shalom, for a path that is toward wholeness, toward empowerment of others, toward inclusiveness, toward this right relationship with everyone and everything, with God and all things. So that path of shalom is key to the systemic functioning. And when people get off of that, then we see things begin to fall apart. So I'd said a 2,300-year-old example. Well, here's a text from Isaiah from about the 8th century BC, 6th century BC, 700, and I'm going to read to you from Isaiah 1, chapter 1. And what's fascinating about this is an illustration from 2,300 years ago. Isaiah is a prophet, and prophets, as we understand, prophets speak to the truth that they see. They speak truth to power. They cannot not speak to the dysfunction that they see. And it's like they're pinpointed. They come out of the woodwork. They come out of the essence of the community. Farmers, shepherds. They're not powerful individuals, but their voice is powerful because of their passion, because they see the truth and they can't let go of it. And so Isaiah is one who's coming out and he's speaking to the people of Israel, and they're falling apart and they're about to fall into exile under Babylonian rule. And so he's speaking the future, but it's not really predicting the future. Prophets speak to the inevitable. When things fall apart, when things are out of sync, when things are inharmonious and dysfunctional, what's the obvious conclusion? If you don't fix it, if you don't get back on track, it's not sustainable. It's gonna fall apart. And so he so he begins this chapter. He says, "Here is the vision that Isaiah saw regarding Judah and Jerusalem during some very challenging times." I'm reading from the Message. And God says, "Let heaven and earth be my jury. Listen to my case. I had children, and I raised them well, and they turned on me. My people don't know up from down. My people have walked out on me, turned their backs on the very Holy One in their midst, walked off, never looked back. And so I say, why bother even trying to do anything with you when you just keep to your bullheaded ways?" And then a little further down, God says, "I don't even want to listen to your worship. I don't want to pay attention to all of your ceremonies. They're all vacuous. They're all empty. If you're going to start praying to me, I'm not even going to start. I'm just going to turn my back and start listening and stop listening. What's the point?" And you know why? Because it says, "You've been tearing people to pieces, and your hands are bloody." And what is it that they've done that's so bad? The leaders have become turncoats, keeping company with crooks. They've sold themselves to the highest bidder, and they've never stood up. They've forgotten to stand up for the homeless and to advocate for those who are in pain. So Isaiah has this 2,300-year-old example of a system that's broken. And it's this idea that God has been there, been present, and yet they have turned their backs on their own people. And they have become desolate. They're going to fall into ruins. In fact, he says in chapter 5, he describes, well, I'll just say it. He describes Israel as a vineyard. It's like a love poem to Israel. He says, "I am the vine gardener and you're the vineyard, and I came and I gave you the best vines, the best soil. I gave you a hut from which to watch over everything. I gave you the rain and the sun. And then what did you do? You ignored it. You stopped paying attention to it, and the vines began to wither up. And when I had planted what he called grapes for justice, grapes for righteousness," that's that right relationship and balance, he said, "and I'd given you all of that, and what did you give me back? But injustice, and you gave me back oppression and graft and theft." Essentially, he says, the grapes that you've produced are useless. He said, "You've ignored the plight of the poor. You've bought up land like a corporate land grabber. And now you've got all of this for yourself while everyone else." It's describing this great disparity where like the top 1 or 2% have everything and the rest have hardly anything and can barely make ends meet. And so God says, "And so I will look upon my vineyard now, and you will become like a hut in a cucumber garden." And what's important to understand about this idea of a hut in a cucumber garden is this systemic reality that it's sort of an illogical pairing up. It's like Jesus in his parables. He would use images that don't make sense in order to disrupt you, to shock you, or even to mock the situation. So Isaiah is saying a hut would be used in a vineyard properly, because you don't need more than a couple of days shade to be watching the vineyard as the people take the harvest and as they mash the grapes and such. It's only a few days process. You've got to move quick because the grapes are ripe. But in a cucumber field, that takes a much longer process for gardening, for cultivating, and for harvesting. So you would build something called a lodge. So here's this image of the kingdom, the community, the Israel has become so useless, so pointless in what it's done now, so self-destructive, that God says, you're just going to be like a hut in a garden of cucumbers. You're going to be just a waste, just left to fall apart, to ruin, in the wrong place now and at the wrong time. You're useless. So he's given this pronouncement of what happens when things are so dysfunctional and no one's paying attention. Now, I have this experience when I would go to schools, and it was an amazing learning experience where I got schooled again. As a tourist, as a touring artist and author, I get to go to elementary schools, middle schools, and I did that for almost 20 years. And no matter what school I went into, I could begin to tell after a couple of years what the system would be like, how it might be functioning. I could walk in, and if I met the principal first thing, then it depended on how the principal interacted with me. I could tell how the principal and how the whole system would work. If the principal was unengaged, was sort of passé and ambivalent about my presence, I was hired by an arts group. The auditorium is down there. Someone would be down there to greet you and then walk away. I knew at that moment, for the most part, that the system in that school, that the relationship with the students were going to be disconnected, that the students would be a little more chaotic and unrelated well to each other, disinterested in sort of paying attention to one another. Teachers would be all about the numbers, all about the grade and the academic scores, and even they would exhibit this sort of disconnect with where the kids were, so that they really wouldn't even pay attention to me when I was doing the programs. You could just sense this disconnect. If I saw the students first, I could tell. If I saw teachers first, if I saw the principal first. I could walk into other schools where the principal would come and then ask me questions. What do you do? How did you get started in this? What is this about? What are your core values that you're bringing to the kids? When they took interest in me, I knew they were taking interest in their students. I knew the teachers would take interest. I knew the principal administrators took interest in the teachers. You could feel it, because from top down and from the bottom up, there was an interest in one another that was centered around this unspoken vision. It wasn't as if they had this really, I'm sure they had a clear objective, but it was this unspoken vision that students are people of worth. No matter who they are, where they are, what their background is, they need to know not just the academics, but more importantly, their value, their worth in relationship. So one of the communities I went to out in New Mexico, which was just a school, it was an arts-based school around academics around arts, and it was a low-income school, a high-risk school, and a third of the students probably had parents that were in the local prison there, federal prison that was there, and it was one of the most productive, engaged, highest parent participation rate of all the schools in the district. It was a model school, even though the scores were not as high as some of the other pressured schools that were focused on the academics. What was high was that there was the matriculation rate was higher in percentage of students that moved from elementary to middle school and then so on. And it was because of that core value, human worth. Each one of them had individual worth that belonged to the larger system. They mattered. And what you find is that when that happens, you see students, you see systems working together around that goal. Martin Buber put it this way, we've talked about it before, when he said we need to develop that I-thou relationship with one another, seeing one another as sacred, recognizing that the time and the moments between us are sacred opportunities for experiencing the holy. But that requires a kind of value, a kind of attentiveness, a kind of listening that honors God in the other person, that honors sacredness in the other person. It's as if we're seeing that person more than ourselves in order to learn from what that person has to offer. That's what it means to find shalom, to be on that path towards creating a functional system. Linda told me this wonderful story. I'll share it with you very quickly before closing up with a final thought. There's these two boys that are 5 years old, a small black child and a white child, and they're trying to fool their teacher, and so they've asked their parents to give them a burr haircut because, as they tell us later, they said that we just wanted to trick our teacher because she won't be able to tell us apart. I think Hans is going to throw up the picture here. This is so heartening. It's so encouraging because we recognize that racism is a learned reality. It is not a DNA biological reality. It's a learned reality that is in place, in patterns throughout our history. And so what the kids see is not their differences. If you asked them if one of them was black and one was white, they'd probably say sure, but they don't see that. It's not they're colorblind. What they do see is what they value in one another. That's what they see. You can't tell that apart. And that's where we are mixed up. That's where we're dysfunctional right now. We've lost that ability, if we ever had it at all, to be able to see ourselves in each other, to be able to see the other in us, and for the other to see us in them. That's the key, I think. And that comes from listening. That comes from being attentive. That comes from compassion. I listened recently to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was interviewing Ezra Klein, and he said he was hopeful. And Ezra Klein said, how can you be hopeful at a time like this? If anything, we've been exposed to some really hardships and hard realities of not just police violence, but violence against blacks in general. And Ta-Nehisi Coates said, if you go back to 1968, only 30% of the population in America approved of Martin Luther King's marches and what he was doing. Only 30%. We forget that. He said, I look out now and I see the protests that have arisen because of these things that have been happening. He said, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee a year ago, he said everyone threw up their arms in frustration. Even from the top down, there was criticism. It was sort of like you're not being patriotic, but what they were doing was they were telling a story that was hiding a dysfunction, because true patriotism ought to be about exposing dysfunction, exposing injustice. That's really what true patriotism ought to be about if we're a part of a system together. Otherwise, we're a part of a system that's just dysfunctional. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates said, what gives me hope now is that now I'm seeing that that there are as many whites out protesting with as many blacks. They're almost even, if not sometimes more whites than blacks, advocating for Black Lives Matter, advocating for righting the wrongs of injustice, advocating for changed policies in policing and in law enforcement and in incarceration. All these things are happening, and whites advocating for understanding, exploring, trying to find their part in the process. That's really what we have this opportunity to do right now. As we see the system dysfunctioning, things are being broken open in a way that allow us to take a moment, if we will, to ask ourselves, who am I in relation to this system? How am I functioning for its functionality, for its purpose of healing and wholeness and shalom? And how am I functioning in a way that perpetuates its dysfunction? We'll talk more about this. Linda and I will be together next week, and I hope you'll join us again. Especially stick around for a minute. The Sharm's going to read a prayer from Bishop Woody White, a powerful prayer that I think we need to all hear at this time. And then finally, if anything can say what we're trying to say in a beautiful, succinct way, it's often a lyricist and their music. And so we're going to hear the song Crowded Table with, I think, Krista Russell and Hannah Kirby are joining Brad Thompson and the band. It's amazing. I'll be surprised if it doesn't inspire you. Have a blessed week. Have an open mind. Let the world speak to you in ways that point you toward the truth of shalom. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.